Someone just said something that made your blood surge and your jaw tighten, and in that split second, you felt the old reflex wake up, the urge to strike back with words sharp enough to cut, because everyone was watching and silence felt like surrender. But this is exactly the moment the ancient Stoics would tell you to pause, not because you are weak, but because strength begins where impulse ends, and the person who masters that moment owns the room without raising their voice. This lesson is not about winning arguments or humiliating an opponent. It is about preserving dignity, clarity, and authority when others try to drag you into noise. And the first response the Stoics relied on for centuries is deceptively simple and devastatingly effective: genuine curiosity. When someone attacks your ideas or your character, instead of defending yourself or counterattacking, you calmly say, "I see your point. Help me understand your reasoning." That sentence alone flips the entire power structure of the interaction, because the aggressor prepared for a fight, not for an invitation to explain themselves. Most verbal attacks are emotional reactions dressed up as opinions, and emotion collapses the moment it is asked to justify itself with reason. There is a quiet confidence in asking for clarity, because you are not rushing to protect your ego. You are signaling that truth matters more than pride. I once watched this play out in a tense professional setting where a colleague interrupted a presentation with a sweeping dismissal, calling the proposal unrealistic and out of touch, words designed to provoke embarrassment and force a defensive scramble. The room froze, waiting for the inevitable argument, but instead the presenter paused, met the criticism without tension, and asked which specific assumptions were unrealistic and why. In that instant, the spotlight shifted, not with hostility, but with expectation, and the critic began to stumble because vague judgments collapse when pressed for details. What looked like confidence was exposed as impulse, and the conversation returned to reason without a single insult exchanged. This response works because it forces a transition from reaction to explanation, and many people who criticize loudly have never actually examined their own position. They rely on labels like naive or uninformed, because labels are easy, but explanations require thought. By inviting explanation, you are not conceding ground, you are reclaiming it. The Stoics admired Socrates for this exact approach, not because he argued well, but because he questioned well, and questioning is the language of control. When you ask someone to explain their reasoning, you move from being the target to being the one guiding the conversation, and now the burden of proof rests on them, not you. Psychologically, this is powerful because anger thrives on momentum, and curiosity stops momentum cold. It engages the rational mind, and the rational mind cannot coexist with uncontrolled aggression for long. There is also a deeper Stoic discipline at work here, the discipline of perception, which teaches us to separate what is said from how it makes us feel. When you respond with curiosity, you are telling yourself that words do not own you, that your inner state is not at the mercy of another person's tone. This is not passive, it is disciplined. It requires you to breathe, to listen, and to resist the impulse to prove yourself immediately. And that resistance is the very muscle Stoicism aims to strengthen. Tone matters here more than words, because curiosity must be genuine, not theatrical. If your voice carries sarcasm or challenge, the method collapses, and the exchange turns into a duel again. But when curiosity is sincere, something remarkable happens. Either the other person reveals that they have nothing substantial to add, or they present a legitimate concern that improves the outcome. In both cases, you win without fighting, because dignity is preserved and clarity emerges. This response is especially effective in group settings, where witnesses can see the contrast between composure and aggression, between someone seeking understanding and someone seeking dominance. The Stoics understood that reputation is shaped less by what you say and more by how you carry yourself under pressure, and curiosity under fire signals confidence at a level that shouting never could. There is also humility embedded in this approach, the humility to accept that you may not know everything, which paradoxically makes others trust you more, not less. True authority does not fear questions, and true strength does not need to rush to self-defense. But here is the critical transition you must be prepared for, because sometimes curiosity reveals that the criticism is actually valid, that there is truth hidden beneath a poorly delivered message. And when that happens, curiosity alone is not enough. That is when the second Stoic response becomes essential, because wisdom is not only knowing when to ask questions, but knowing when to accept responsibility without resistance. When curiosity reveals that the other person actually has a valid point, this is where most people fail, because ego rushes in to protect identity instead of truth. But the Stoic path takes a different turn, one that feels counterintuitive yet immediately dissolves conflict. You acknowledge reality and act. The second response is simple and disarming. You're absolutely right, and here's what I'm going to do about it. This is not surrender, it is strategic ownership, and it works because most criticism is fueled by one of two desires. Either the critic wants to see you collapse into excuses, or they want to see the problem resolved. When you choose resolution instantly, you remove the oxygen from the fire. There is nothing left to argue about because the purpose of the attack has already been fulfilled. In that moment, power shifts again, not through dominance, but through leadership. Instead of being the person under scrutiny, you become the person setting direction. I have seen rooms full of tension relax in seconds when someone stops explaining and starts acting, because action communicates seriousness far louder than defense ever could. Imagine a situation where a client or colleague points out a repeated failure, missed deadlines, poor communication, or inconsistency. The instinctive reaction is to list all the reasons, the obstacles, the context that explains why it happened. But explanation often sounds like avoidance, even when it is true. The Stoic understands that reality does not care about reasons, it only responds to correction. By saying, "You're right," without qualification, you demonstrate emotional maturity. And by immediately stating what you will change, you demonstrate competence. The conversation moves forward instead of circling the past. This response works because it aligns words with behavior, and people trust behavior far more than narratives. There is a quiet confidence in not needing to justify yourself, because justification implies insecurity, while ownership implies authority. The Stoics believed that character is revealed not in comfort, but in friction. And nothing reveals character faster than how you respond when you are genuinely at fault. Accepting responsibility without drama signals that your identity is not threatened by imperfection. It tells others that you are stable enough to face reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. This is why this response often turns critics into collaborators, because the moment you stop resisting the truth, the other person no longer needs to push. Their role shifts from attacker to participant, from adversary to partner. There is also a psychological reversal that happens here. When someone criticizes you, they expect tension, defensiveness, or denial. When you calmly agree and outline a plan, their nervous system downshifts. They feel heard, validated, and respected, and once those needs are met, aggression loses its purpose. This does not mean you accept blame for things outside your control. Stoic wisdom is not self-punishment, it is alignment with reality. You only use this response when the criticism is accurate. If someone is projecting, manipulating, or accusing unfairly, agreement would be dishonest and damaging. But when the fault is real, owning it immediately preserves credibility and saves time. Epictetus taught that philosophy is not something you talk about, it is something you live. and nothing embodies that more clearly than taking responsibility without being forced. There is also freedom in this response, because once you admit the truth, you are no longer trapped defending a position that drains your energy. You are free to focus on improvement instead of image management. Over time, people begin to associate you with reliability rather than perfection, and reliability builds far deeper respect. Another subtle strength of this approach is that it prevents escalation. Many conflicts grow not because of the original mistake, but because of the resistance that follows it. When resistance disappears, so does the conflict. You end the battle before it begins, not by overpowering the other person, but by refusing to fight reality. This is Stoic discipline in its purest form, choosing effectiveness over ego, progress over pride. However, not all attacks come from a desire for improvement. Some people provoke not to solve, but to feel superior, to destabilize, or to test your emotional control. When curiosity reveals nothing of substance and ownership would be false, you need a different kind of response, one that exposes the attack without attacking back. That is where the third Stoic response becomes essential, because it turns provocation into self-exposure and lets the aggressor reveal themselves without you lifting a finger. When criticism is not rooted in truth and curiosity reveals nothing but bias, assumption, or provocation, the Stoic does not defend, explain, or escalate. Instead, they allow the other person to expose themselves, and the third response does exactly that. That's an interesting perspective. What made you think of it? This sentence appears harmless, even polite, but it is one of the most psychologically precise tools ever used in conflict, because it redirects attention away from you and back onto the speaker's inner world. Most attacks are not arguments, they are emotional leaks, fragments of insecurity, envy, or ignorance dressed up as confidence. And when you ask someone to trace the origin of their opinion, you force them to confront something they rarely examine, their own reasoning. The Stoics understood that most people speak from impulse rather than reflection, and when impulse is asked to justify itself, it often collapses. This response works because it does not accuse, contradict, or resist. It simply invites explanation, and explanation is where weak positions fall apart. I once watched this play out in a social setting where a successful professional was casually dismissed with a sarcastic remark implying their work lacked seriousness or value. Instead of defending their achievements, they responded calmly with that single question: "What made you think of it?" The room shifted instantly. The person who made the comment hesitated, searched for words, and eventually admitted they didn't actually know much about the field they were criticizing. In that moment, the insult dissolved on its own, not because it was challenged, but because it was examined. This is the quiet brilliance of the Stoic approach. You do not fight ignorance, you illuminate it, and light does the work for you. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy, and this response embodies that principle fully. While the aggressor tries to pull you into emotional reaction, you remain composed, curious, and grounded, and the contrast becomes visible to everyone present. The power is not in the words themselves, but in the tone, which must be genuine, calm, and free of sarcasm. If you deliver this response with mockery, it becomes an attack. But when delivered with sincere curiosity, it becomes a mirror. People are rarely prepared to look into that mirror. They expected resistance, not reflection. Psychologically, this question forces the speaker to move from their emotional brain into their rational brain, and many provocative statements cannot survive that transition. They were never built on thought, only feeling. Once asked to explain, the speaker faces a choice: either admit uncertainty, soften their position, or double down and reveal even more about their character. In all three outcomes, you gain clarity without losing dignity. This response is especially effective with people who rely on stereotypes, assumptions, or shallow judgments. It also works in professional environments, family settings, and social situations where direct confrontation would escalate tension. You are not invalidating their opinion, you are simply asking them to take responsibility for it. That subtle shift changes everything. Another Stoic layer here is detachment from outcome. You are not asking this question to win, embarrass, or dominate. You ask it because truth matters more than appearance. If the other person turns out to have a thoughtful reason, you can engage constructively. If they do not, the conversation naturally deflates. Either way, you remain aligned with reason. Seneca warned that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and many verbal attacks live entirely in imagination until they are examined. When you calmly ask for the origin of someone's judgment, you bring it into reality, where it must stand on something solid or fall apart. This response also protects your inner peace, because you are no longer absorbing the emotional weight of the insult, you are observing it. Observation creates distance, and distance creates control. Over time, practicing this response trains you to stop internalizing other people's projections. You begin to see insults not as truths about you, but as information about them. That shift is deeply liberating. However, there are moments when curiosity and exposure are not enough. When someone is not ignorant or reactive, but simply emotionally charged and hostile, determined to unload frustration regardless of your composure. In those moments, reason must give way to something even more disarming than logic, something most people never expect in conflict: sincere appreciation. That is where the fourth response enters, and it has the power to turn hostility into cooperation almost instantly. When reason and curiosity no longer soften the exchange and the other person remains tense, defensive, or aggressive, the Stoic reaches for a response that feels counterintuitive but is devastatingly effective. I appreciate you sharing that with me. Gratitude, when offered sincerely in the face of hostility, has a unique psychological effect because it disrupts the expected script of conflict. Most people approach confrontation prepared for resistance, excuses, or counterattacks, and when instead they are met with appreciation, their nervous system has nowhere to go. The aggression loses its fuel. This response is not submission, and it is not approval of poor behavior. It is emotional judo. You redirect the force instead of absorbing it. Seneca taught that the wise person separates intention from delivery, and this response does exactly that. You acknowledge that the person had something they felt compelled to express without rewarding the hostility in how they expressed it. I once witnessed this in a workplace setting where a manager delivered feedback in an unnecessarily harsh tone, listing complaints publicly and clearly venting personal frustration. The employee could have defended themselves or shut down completely, but instead they responded calmly, thanking the manager for being direct and expressing appreciation for the chance to improve. The tension in the room immediately dissolved. The manager's posture changed, their voice softened, and the conversation shifted from accusation to solution. What happened was not magic, it was human psychology. When you respond with gratitude, you validate the person's underlying need to be heard, which is often what drives aggressive behavior in the first place. Once that need is met, the aggression loses purpose. This response works because it reframes the interaction. Instead of two opponents, there are now two participants addressing an issue. It moves the conversation from ego to problem solving. The Stoics believed that emotional self-regulation was the highest form of power, and here that regulation becomes visible to everyone involved. You are demonstrating that your stability does not depend on being treated gently. You can remain grounded even when others are not. That alone commands respect. However, this response must be authentic. Gratitude used sarcastically becomes mockery, and mockery reignites conflict. The strength of this approach lies in sincerity. You are not thanking them for being rude. You are thanking them for expressing something that might otherwise remain unresolved. That distinction matters. Psychologically, gratitude activates a cooperative response in the brain. It signals safety, lowers defenses, and invites reciprocity. People treated as reasonable often become reasonable. This does not mean you allow disrespect to continue unchecked. Gratitude is the opening move, not the conclusion. Once the emotional temperature drops, boundaries can be set calmly and clearly. The Stoic does not avoid boundaries. They simply deliver them without heat. Another reason this response is so powerful is that it protects your internal state. Instead of replaying the insult or complaint later, you experience closure in the moment. You chose composure. You chose control. Epictetus reminded us that no one can harm us without our consent, and gratitude withdraws that consent instantly. The insult has nowhere to land. It passes through without lodging in your identity. Over time, practicing this response builds a reputation that precedes you. People learn that emotional outbursts do not move you, that hostility does not bait you, and that if they want engagement, they must approach with clarity rather than aggression. This changes how others treat you long-term. There is also a deeper Stoic layer here, one that speaks to character rather than technique. Gratitude in conflict is a declaration that your values are not conditional. You do not need perfect circumstances to act with dignity. You carry it with you. That consistency is the foundation of inner peace. But even this response has its limits. Some individuals are not looking to be heard, understood, or resolved. They are looking to dominate, provoke, or humiliate. They continue pushing regardless of your calm, curiosity, or gratitude. In those moments, the Stoic does not argue further, does not explain, and does not seek resolution. Instead, they step into the most powerful response of all, one that requires almost no words, only presence, restraint, and timing: silence. Not passive silence, but intentional silence, paired with composure. This final response does not aim to change the other person. It aims to protect your dignity completely. That is where true mastery reveals itself, and that is exactly what we will examine next. When all other responses have been exhausted, and the other person persists, unmoved by curiosity, responsibility, or gratitude, the Stoic turns to the most refined form of strength: deliberate silence, followed by a single, composed acknowledgment. This is not the silence of fear or avoidance. It is intentional silence, chosen with awareness, and it is one of the oldest disciplines taught by the Stoic masters. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best answer to anger is silence, not because silence avoids conflict, but because it exposes it. When someone delivers a comment meant to wound, embarrass, or dominate, they are expecting motion from you, a reaction that confirms their power. Silence denies them that confirmation. It creates a vacuum where their words must stand on their own, stripped of distraction. The pause is critical. A few seconds of stillness forces everyone present, including the speaker, to truly hear what was said. In that pause, the emotional weight of their words becomes visible. Often, people begin to feel discomfort not because of anything you did, but because of what they did. After the pause comes the response, delivered calmly and without irony. Thank you for that insight. Nothing more, no explanation, no defense, no counterattack. This sentence is devastatingly effective because it reframes the entire exchange. You are not agreeing with them, and you are not rejecting them. You are acknowledging that something was said and declining to carry it further. Psychologically, this response places the burden back where it belongs. The aggressor is left holding their own behavior, now fully illuminated. In group settings, this is especially powerful. The silence allows others to judge the comment independently, without being influenced by your emotional reaction. People stop evaluating the content of the attack and begin evaluating the character of the person who made it. I have seen careers altered by this moment alone. A public insult followed by a measured pause and a dignified response often reveals insecurity, arrogance, or poor judgment more clearly than any rebuttal ever could. Epictetus taught that we should practice distinguishing what is within our control from what is not. You cannot control another person's rudeness, but you can control whether you dignify it with energy. This response is the embodiment of that principle. You choose not to wrestle in the mud. You stand still while the other person sinks into the consequences of their own words. The reason this works so reliably is that human beings are social mirrors. When someone behaves aggressively, they expect opposition. When they are met with calm, their nervous system has no reference point. Confusion replaces momentum. Embarrassment often follows. The silence communicates confidence without saying it. It says, without words, that you are not threatened, not shaken, and not dependent on approval. This is why the tone must remain neutral and sincere. If the thank you is delivered sarcastically, the spell breaks. Sarcasm invites escalation. Sincerity ends it. You are not thanking them to mock them. You are thanking them because you are finished engaging. That distinction matters. There is also a deeper internal benefit to this response. When you pause instead of reacting, you prevent the emotional residue that so often lingers after conflict. You do not replay the moment later, wishing you had said something different. You said exactly what aligned with your values. The Stoics believed that peace of mind comes not from controlling outcomes, but from acting in accordance with reason. This response preserves that peace. It closes the interaction cleanly. It draws a boundary without announcing one. Over time, people learn something important about you. They learn that provocation does not grant them access to your emotions. They learn that disrespect does not buy attention. They learn that if they want dialogue, they must bring clarity and respect, not theatrics. This changes the way you are treated long before words are exchanged. It is also important to understand when to use this response. This is not for constructive criticism, honest disagreement, or conversations where resolution is possible. This response is reserved for moments when the line has already been crossed and engagement would only degrade your dignity. The Stoic does not overuse silence, but they do not hesitate to use it when wisdom demands restraint. Silence, in this context, is not the absence of strength. It is the visible presence of it. By now, you can see the pattern across all 5 responses. None of them seek to dominate. None of them aim to humiliate. Each one keeps your center intact while allowing the other person to reveal their level of maturity. That is the true advantage of Stoic communication. You are not trying to win the moment. You are protecting the self that must live with the moment afterward. What remains is the final synthesis, the deeper lesson that ties all 5 responses together and shows how they form a single discipline rather than isolated techniques. That is where the Stoic path becomes complete, and that is what we will conclude with next. At this point, it should be clear that these 5 responses are not tricks, scripts, or clever lines meant to dominate a conversation. They are expressions of a single discipline, self-mastery. The Stoics never taught communication as a way to control others. They taught it as a way to remain free from being controlled. Every response you have learned works for the same reason. It keeps your mind sovereign. When someone insults you, criticizes you, or tries to provoke you, the real danger is not their words. The danger is the moment you surrender your inner order and let their behavior dictate your emotional state. Marcus Aurelius warned that when you allow another person to disturb your peace, you hand them authority they did not earn. These responses are tools to prevent that surrender. The first response, genuine curiosity, shifts the exchange from emotion to reason. The second, immediate responsibility, dissolves conflict by removing ego from the equation. The third, reflective curiosity, allows others to expose themselves without you lifting a finger. The fourth, gratitude, transforms hostility into cooperation by disarming intent. And the fifth, intentional silence, ends the encounter altogether while preserving your dignity. Together, they form a complete system. You begin with openness, move through accountability, invite self-reflection, offer respect, and finally, when necessary, withdraw your energy entirely. This progression mirrors Stoic philosophy itself. Engage the world rationally, act virtuously, and detach from outcomes you cannot control. What matters is not whether the other person learns a lesson. What matters is that you do not abandon your values in the heat of the moment. Too many people believe strength means having the perfect comeback or the sharpest words. The Stoics understood something far deeper. Strength is restraint. Strength is choosing not to react when reaction would cost you your clarity. Strength is leaving a conversation with your character intact. Over time, this discipline changes the way people interact with you. Those who thrive on drama lose interest because they gain no reward. Those who seek respect adjust their tone because they sense your boundaries. And those who are capable of growth often meet you at a higher level of dialogue. You become someone who is difficult to manipulate, not because you are aggressive, but because you are grounded. This is why Stoic responses are so powerful in professional settings, family dynamics, and public conflict. They do not escalate tension, they reveal it. They do not inflame egos, they expose them. And most importantly, they protect the one thing the Stoics valued above all else: inner tranquility. Epictetus reminded his students that no one can harm you unless you consent to be harmed. And consent is given the moment you surrender control over your response. Every time you choose one of these responses, you are refusing that consent. You are saying, silently or aloud, that your peace is not negotiable. This does not mean you avoid conflict forever. It means you engage conflict on your terms, guided by reason rather than impulse. There will be moments when you stumble. No one applies wisdom perfectly. Even the Stoics acknowledge this. The goal is not perfection, but practice. Each encounter becomes a training ground. Each provocation becomes an opportunity to strengthen discipline. Over time, you will notice something subtle but profound. Your reactions will slow, your emotions will feel less volatile, and situations that once consumed your thoughts will pass through your mind without leaving damage behind. That is the quiet victory Stoicism offers. Not applause, not dominance, but freedom. Freedom from being pulled into battles that do not serve you. Freedom from regret over words spoken in anger. Freedom from allowing others to define your emotional landscape. When you master your responses, you master your experience of life. So remember this: when someone tests you, you do not need to win the argument. You need to preserve the self that walks away from it. Speak when reason demands it. Pause when emotion tempts you. And never forget that the most powerful response is the one that leaves you at peace when the moment has passed. That is Stoic strength.